Janet sat quietly on the small wooden porch of their modest house, her eyes fixed on the dusty path leading to their front door. She was deep in thought, reflecting on the life she had shared with her mother since her father's death. She could barely remember him, just unclear images of a man with a warm smile and strong hands that would lift her up high into the air. But those memories were faint, almost like a dream she had long ago. Her mother was the one constant in her life, a pillar of strength who had done everything she could to provide for them. Inside the house, Janet's mother, Mrs. John, was busy preparing a simple dinner of rice and beans. The kitchen was small and worn, just like the rest of the house, but it was home. Mrs. John had worked tirelessly for years, taking on any job she could find to put food on the table. Life hadn't been easy for them. They often had to make do with very little, living from hand to mouth, but they had managed to get by. As Janet walked into the kitchen, the aroma of the cooking food filled the air, but it wasn't enough to lift the heavy atmosphere. "Mom," she began hesitantly, "we need to talk about the examination fees." Mrs. John paused, her hand hovering over the pot. She didn't look at Janet, but the tension in her shoulders was telling. "I know, Janet," she replied softly. "I've been thinking about it too." "Mom, it's my last year in secondary school," Janet said, her voice tinged with desperation. "If I don't write these exams, I won't be able to get into the university. We can't just give up now." Mrs. John turned to face her daughter, her eyes filled with both love and sadness. "I know how important this is to you, sweetheart," she said, reaching out to take Janet's hand. "But things have been really hard lately. I've been trying to save, but it's just not enough." Tears welled up in Janet's eyes as she tried to hold back the overwhelming sense of helplessness that was building inside her. "There must be something we can do, Mom. Maybe I could get a job after school, or we could borrow the money from someone." Mrs. John shook her head, her face etched with worry. "I don't want you to take on that burden, Janet. You should be focusing on your studies, not worrying about money." "But what other choice do we have?" Janet asked, her voice breaking. Mrs. John sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. "I don't know, Janet. I don't know what to do." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the only sound the gentle bubbling of the pot on the stove. Janet felt a mix of frustration and sadness, but she also knew that her mother had done everything she could for her. Despite the difficulties, they had always had each other, and that was something no amount of money could change. "We'll find a way," Mrs. John finally said, though there was a hint of doubt in her voice. "We have to believe that something will work out." Janet nodded, trying to find comfort in her mother's words. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, and their options were dwindling. Janet's world seemed to crumble when her mother broke the news. They were seated in the small living room, the old clock ticking loudly in the background. "Janet, you won't be writing the examination this year," her mother said, her voice gentle but firm. "We don't have enough money for the fees right now." Janet's heart sank. But Mom, I've been studying so hard. I can't just wait another year." Her voice wavered as she fought back tears. Her mother's eyes were filled with regret. "I know, sweetheart. It breaks my heart to say this, but there's no other way. We save up, and you can write it next year." Before Janet could protest further, a knock on the door interrupted their conversation. It was Aunt Kate, her mother's older sister, who always seemed to arrive at the most unexpected times. "I heard what's going on," Aunt Kate said as she stepped into the room, her eyes full of determination. "And I'm here to help." Janet looked at her aunt with a glimmer of hope. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. "I'll pay for your fees," Aunt Kate announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. but there's one condition. You come live with me until you finish your exams. I take good care of you." Janet hesitated, glancing at her mother for reassurance. Her mother nodded slowly. "It's a good opportunity, Janet. Your aunt will make sure you have everything you need." After a moment of consideration, Janet agreed. "Okay, Aunt Kate. I'll go with you." The next day, Janet packed her bags and left for her aunt's house. As soon as she arrived, she noticed a young man standing by the door, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. He was tall and well-dressed, but something about the way he stared at her sent shivers down her spine. "Is that your husband?" Janet asked, trying to sound casual as she turned to Aunt Kate. Aunt Kate laughed softly. "No, darling. This is Joshua, my friend's son. He's staying with us for a while." Joshua continued to stare at Janet behind as she walked, and then he let out an ominous smile. Janet settled into her aunt's house, which was much larger and more comfortable than the small home she had shared with her mother. Her aunt, true to her word, had given her a room of her own. It was a cozy space with a soft bed, a small desk for studying, and a window that overlooked the garden. However, the room next to Joshua's room made her uneasy. Aunt Kate's husband, Mr. Peter, was often away on business trips, leaving the house mostly to Janet, her aunt, and Joshua. Janet soon noticed that Mr. Peter was a frequent traveler, rarely spending more than a few days at home before he was off again. "He's always been like this," Aunt Kate had explained one evening over dinner. "Business keeps him busy, but he sends his love." Joshua, on the other hand, was almost always around. He was polite enough, greeting her with a nod or a small smile whenever they crossed paths, but something about his presence unsettled her. She often caught him staring at her from across the room, his gaze staring longer than it should. One evening, as Janet was arranging her textbooks on the desk, she noticed Joshua standing in the hallway, his eyes fixed on her through the open door. She pretended not to see him and continued with her work, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. There was something about his gaze that made her feel vulnerable, like she was being watched too closely. At dinner that night, Janet couldn't help but feel Joshua's eyes on her as she ate. It was as if he was studying her every move, and it made her increasingly uncomfortable. "Aunt Kate," she began cautiously, "how long will Joshua be staying here?" Aunt Kate looked up from her plate, surprised by the question. "Oh, Joshua. He'll be with us for quite a long time, I think. His mother is my very close friend." "Why do you ask?" "No reason, really," Janet replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just curious." But as the days passed, Janet's discomfort grew. Every time she walked down the hallway or entered a room, she felt Mark's presence, as if he were always lurking nearby. She tried to focus on her studies, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. She found herself avoiding the common areas of the house, preferring to stay in her room with the door closed. One afternoon, as Janet was reading on her bed, she heard a soft knock on her door. "Come in," she called, expecting it to be Aunt Kate. But it was Joshua, standing in the doorway with that same intense look in his eyes. Janet quickly adapted to the rhythms of her new home. Aunt Kate and her best friend, Mrs. Idris, who was also Joshua's mother, were inseparable. They would often go out together for shopping, lunch, or just to catch up on life. Their laughter would echo through the house as they prepared to leave, leaving Janet alone with Joshua more often than she liked. "Janet, we are heading out for a bit," Aunt Kate called one afternoon as she grabbed her purse. Mrs. Idris stood by the door, smiling warmly at Janet. "We won't be long. If you need anything, Joshua's here." Janet forced a smile. "Okay, Aunt Kate. Have fun." But inside, her heart sank. Being left alone with Joshua always made her uneasy. There was something about the way he watched her, like a predator waiting for the right moment. As soon as they left, the house fell silent, except for the ticking of the clock in the hallway. Janet decided to take a long bath to relax and try to shake off the creeping sense of dread. She gathered her clothes and a towel and headed to the bathroom, locking the door behind her. The warm water was soothing, and for a moment, Janet allowed herself to relax. She let the water run over her, washing away the tension that had been building up inside her. But just as she was rinsing the shampoo from her hair, she heard a voice outside the bathroom door. "Come out quick, I'm waiting for you," Joshua said, his tone low but sounded dead serious and dreadful. Janet stood frozen in the bathroom, her heart pounding as the young man's words echoed in her mind. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. Did he really mean what she thought he did? "What do you mean by that, Joshua?" she called out, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. Joshua's laugh sent chills down her spine. "Come on, Janet," he said, his tone mockingly sweet. "Don't pretend like you don't know. I know you've done this before." Janet's stomach turned. "Done what before? What are you talking about?" she demanded, but there was a tremor in her voice that betrayed her fear. "Don't play dumb," Joshua replied, his voice dripping with malice. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. Now stop hiding and come out." Panic surged through Janet as she realized what he was implying. She stayed in the bathroom, her back pressed against the wall as she tried to think of a way out. She couldn't let him get to her. "I'm not coming out, Joshua," she said firmly, trying to sound braver than she felt. Joshua's footsteps grew louder as he approached the bathroom door. "You think you can hide in there forever?" he sneered. "I can hear you, Janet. I know you're scared." Janet's breath caught in her throat as she heard him place his ear against the door. She had to act fast. Without thinking, she pushed the door with all her strength, slamming it into Joshua's head. He let out a yelp of pain, stumbling back as Janet seized the moment. She bolted out of the bathroom and ran to her room, her heart pounding in her chest. She locked the door behind her and backed away, her hands shaking. Joshua was already banging on the door, his voice filled with anger. "You think you're safe in there?" he shouted. "Your aunt and my mom are going to be out for a long time, Janet. It's just you and me now." Janet felt a wave of terror wash over her. She backed up until she hit the edge of her bed, her mind racing. What was she going to do? She couldn't stay in her room forever, but she couldn't face Joshua either. The pounding on the door grew louder, more insistent, as Joshua tried to force his way in. "Let me in, Janet," Joshua's voice was now a low growl. "You're only making this harder on yourself." Suddenly, the banging stopped, and Janet heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was the sound of the front door opening. For a brief moment, hope flared in her chest. Had Aunt Kate and Mrs. Idris returned early? Maybe they could help her. But then she heard voices, deep and unfamiliar, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. "Where is she?" one of the voices asked, and Janet's hope turned to dread. "She's in the room," Joshua's voice answered, smug and confident. "I thought you said you'll have her ready by the time we come for her," the unfamiliar voice said. "I know I said that, but something went a little wrong." "Step aside," the unfamiliar voices said, marching towards the door. Janet's heart immediately sank after hearing those words as she began to hear footsteps approaching the door. Janet stood frozen in her room, her ear pressed against the door, straining to hear any sound. But the house had fallen silent. The men's voices were gone, and even Joshua's footsteps had faded away. For a moment, she wondered if it had all been some horrible dream, but the fear still gripped her too tightly for that to be true. She waited, hardly daring to move, her heart pounding in her chest. Minutes passed, and the silence stretched on. Finally, she dared to breathe a little easier. Maybe they really had left. But why? Just as she was beginning to calm down, there was a gentle knock on her door. Janet's breath caught in her throat as she heard Joshua's voice from the other side, soft and remorseful. "Janet, I'm really sorry about what happened earlier. I didn't mean to scare you. Please, just let me explain." Janet hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She didn't trust him, not after what had just happened. But his voice sounded so sincere, so different from the menacing tone he had used before. I don't know if I can trust you, Joshua, she said, her voice trembling. Please, Janet, Joshua pleaded. I'm really sorry. I was out of line, and I feel terrible about it. I brought you some juice to make up for it. Can we just talk? I promise, no more games. Janet bit her lip, her mind racing. She didn't want to let him in, but she also didn't want to stay locked in her room, terrified and alone. Slowly, she turned the doorknob and opened the door a crack. Joshua stood there, holding a tray with a glass of juice on it, his expression one of genuine regret. I'm really sorry, he said again, his voice gentle. I just want to make things right between us. Janet eyed him warily but stepped back to let him in. Okay, she said quietly, but just for a little while. Joshua handed her the glass of juice, and she took it, still feeling uneasy. They sat down in the living room, and Joshua turned on the TV, scrolling through the channels until he found a movie. I thought we could watch something together, he said, trying to sound casual. Janet nodded, taking a sip of the juice. It was cold and sweet, and she felt a little better as she settled into the couch. But as the movie played, she noticed a strange feeling creeping over her. Her eyelids felt heavy, and her body started to feel like lead. Joshua, what's in this juice? She asked, her voice thick with drowsiness. Joshua didn't answer right away. Instead, he just watched her with that unsettling smile. Just relax, Janet. Everything's going to be fine. Panic flared in Janet's chest, but she couldn't fight it. Her vision blurred, and she struggled to keep her eyes open, but it was no use. Her body betrayed her, sinking deeper into the couch as the world around her faded away. The last thing she saw before her eyes shut completely was Joshua, leaning closer, his smile widening. And then, everything went black. Janet woke up the next morning to find herself laying on the bed. She awoke to a throbbing pain in her head, as if a hammer were pounding inside her skull. The sunlight filtering through the curtains made her squint, and she groaned softly, trying to piece together what had happened the night before. But her memory was fuzzy, and the details slipped through her fingers like sand. As she slowly sat up, Janet realized with a start that she wasn't wearing the clothes she'd had on the previous night. Instead, she was in an old t-shirt and a pair of shorts she didn't remember putting on. Panic gripped her as she tried to recall the events, but everything was a blur. The last thing she could remember was drinking the juice Joshua had given her, and then nothing. Her heart raced as she swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood up, a wave of dizziness washing over her. She needed to find her aunt and figure out what had happened. As she made her way to the living room, her thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. When she reached the parlor, she found her aunt sitting on the couch, going through her mobile phone. Janet hesitated in the doorway, feeling a surge of relief at seeing her, but also a gnawing sense of dread. "Auntie," Janet began, her voice shaky as she walked into the room, "what happened last night?" "I don't remember much." Her aunt looked up from the phone, her expression warm and concerned. "Oh, Janet, you were asleep when I got back last night. I didn't want to wake you. You were fast asleep." Janet's brow furrowed as she tried to process this. You came back last night." "Yes, I did," her aunt confirmed, putting the phone aside, "and I tried waking you up. I tapped and tapped you, yet no response. It was as if you had taken sleeping drugs. You must have been really tired." Janet blinked, the pieces of the puzzle not quite fitting together. "I don't remember that at all. The last thing I remember is watching a movie with Joshua, and then nothing." Her aunt's expression softened. "You've been under a lot of stress, dear. It's no wonder you're feeling a bit disoriented. But everything's fine now. You're safe." "Joshua?" Janet repeated, her mind still swirling with questions. "Where is he? I didn't see him this morning." Her aunt sighed and shook her head slightly. "Oh, Joshua left with his mother early this morning. They had to go back home." Janet's heart skipped a beat. He left. Just like that. Yes, I Aunt said, her tone casual. Joshua suggested they didn't want to wake you. They said their goodbyes and left quietly. Janet stared at her aunt, trying to read between the lines. Something felt off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Did Joshua say anything before he left? Not really, her aunt replied, a hint of confusion in her voice. Why? Is something wrong, Janet? Janet hesitated, unsure of how to explain the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Don't worry, it's nothing. Her aunt sighed again, her patience seemingly wearing thin. Janet, what's the meaning of this nonsense? I said they left. Why all these questions? Janet apologized slowly, but the unease in her chest didn't go away. Janet forced a smile and nodded, but as she headed back to her room, her mind was far from at ease. She felt as if something had happened the night before, something she couldn't remember, but she knew it had something to do with Joshua. Ever since Joshua and his mother had left, something had changed within Janet. The vibrant, lively girl who used to fill the house with laughter and chatter had become a shadow of her former self. She spent most of her days locked away in her room, rarely venturing out, and when she did, it was with a sullen expression that made her aunt worry. Janet's aunt noticed the shift almost immediately. At first, she thought it was just exhaustion, maybe a delayed reaction to all the stress Janet had been under. But as days turned into weeks, it became clear that this wasn't just tiredness. Janet was retreating into herself, and Aunt didn't know why. Janet, Aunt Kate called out one afternoon as she stood by the door to Janet's room, knocking gently. Are you okay, dear? You've been in there for hours. There was a long pause before Janet responded, her voice muffled. I'm fine, Auntie. Just tired. Aunt Kate frowned, her concern deepening. Are you sure, Janet? You've been saying that a lot lately. You're not coming down with something, are you? No, Auntie, Janet replied quickly, almost too quickly. I'm okay. I just need some rest. But Aunt Kate wasn't convinced. Janet had never been the type to isolate herself like this, and it troubled her deeply. She tried to brush it off, to give Janet the space she seemed to need, but as time went on, the unease flashed at her. Something was wrong, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. That evening, during dinner, Aunt Kate decided to confront Janet directly. As they sat at the table, the silence between them was palpable. Janet picked at her food, barely eating, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Janet, Aunt Kate began gently, watching her niece carefully. I've noticed that you've been acting a bit different lately. You're not yourself. Is everything all right? Janet looked up, startled by the question. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm fine, Auntie. Really, I am. Aunt Kate didn't let it go. You don't seem fine, Janet. You've been spending a lot of time alone, and you're not eating like you used to. If something's bothering you, you know you can talk to me, right? Janet nodded, but she didn't say anything. She just stared down at her plate, pushing the food around with her fork. Janet, I'm serious, Aunt pressed, her voice firmer now. I'm worried about you. What's going on? Janet opened her mouth to reply, but before she could say anything, a sudden wave of nausea hit her. She felt her stomach churn violently, and she bolted up from the table, running towards the bathroom. Aunt Kate was on her feet in an instant, following closely behind. Janet. What's wrong? She called out, her voice filled with alarm. Janet barely made it to the toilet before she started vomiting, her body trembling with each retch. Aunt Kate stood behind her, rubbing her back gently as Janet heaved, her concern growing by the second. Oh, Janet, Aunt Kate murmured, worry etched on her face. This isn't just being tired. You've been sick, haven't you? How long has this been going on? Janet shook her head weakly, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. I'm fine, Auntie, she insisted, though her voice was shaky. It's nothing, really. Aunt Kate wasn't convinced. "Janet, this isn't nothing. You've been acting strange for weeks, and now you're throwing up. What's going on? Are you sick? Have you seen a doctor?" "No, I don't need a doctor," Janet replied quickly, standing up on unsteady legs. I'm just stressed, that's all." But Aunt Kate's eyes narrowed, her intuition telling her that there was more to this. "Janet, she said, a knowing tone creeping into her voice. "I hope it's not what I'm thinking, oh." Janet's eyes widened in panic, her heart skipping a beat. "No, Auntie, it's not that," she protested, though she could feel the bar rising in her throat again. "I'm fine, I promise." Aunt Kate crossed her arms, looking at Janet with a mixture of concern and suspicion. "Janet, are you sure? Because if it's what I'm thinking, Janet's stomach churned again, and she couldn't hold it back any longer. She rushed back to the toilet, vomiting violently once more. Aunt Kate watched her, her expression hardening immediately. The days that followed were a blur for Janet. She tried her best to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the persistent nausea and the bouts of vomiting made it nearly impossible. Each time she felt the familiar churn in her stomach, she would rush to the bathroom, hoping her aunt wouldn't notice. But Aunt Kate wasn't easily fooled. Janet would lock herself in the bathroom, leaning over the toilet bowl as she emptied the contents of her stomach. Each time, she would wipe her mouth, take a deep breath, and tell herself it was just a phase, that it would pass. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. Aunt Kate had noticed Janet's behavior changing even more. It wasn't just the isolation anymore, there was a constant look of discomfort on her niece's face, and she was clearly avoiding her. Whenever Aunt Kate tried to engage Janet in conversation, the girl would give short, clipped responses before excusing herself, usually to go to her room or the bathroom. "Janet," Aunt Kate called out one afternoon as she stood in the hallway, listening to the unmistakable sound of retching coming from the bathroom. Her heart sank as she realized what was happening. "Janet, are you okay in there?" There was a long pause before Janet's shaky voice replied, "I'm fine, Auntie. Just something I ate, I think." Aunt Kate frowned, her worry deepening. This wasn't the first time she'd heard Janet say that, and she doubted it was the truth. But she didn't push it, not yet. "All right, dear. Just let me know if you need anything." As the days passed, Janet became more and more withdrawn. She would spend hours in her room, only emerging when absolutely necessary. Aunt Kate could hear her niece pacing back and forth at night, her footsteps a constant reminder that something was seriously wrong. Then, one night, Janet woke up with a sharp, painful urge to vomit. The sensation hit her like a wave, and she barely had time to scramble out of bed and rush to the bathroom. The house was quiet, and she hoped she could make it to the toilet without waking Aunt Kate. She reached the bathroom just in time, collapsing to her knees as she vomited into the toilet. The sound echoed in the small room, and Janet's body shook with each retch. When it finally stopped, she sat back, breathing heavily, her mind racing. "What is actually wrong with me?" she whispered to herself, wiping the sweat from her forehead. Her heart pounded in her chest as the fear she had been trying to suppress came rushing to the surface. Or am I? She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. The idea was too terrifying to even consider. She had been so careful, hadn't she? And yet, the signs were all there. The nausea, the vomiting, the fatigue. Could it really be possible? As Janet sat there, lost in her thoughts, she suddenly became aware of a presence behind her. She turned slowly, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Aunt Kate standing in the doorway, watching her with a mixture of concern and determination. "Auntie." Kate's voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes wide with fear and guilt. Aunt Grace stepped into the bathroom, her expression hardened.